Snow falls silent across the Alaskan wilderness, each flake drifting down to blanket Shadow Moses Island in white. Somewhere in that frozen expanse, a figure lies perfectly still, breath controlled to the point of invisibility, finger resting against a trigger with the patience of someone who has waited days, weeks, even lifetimes for the perfect shot. This is Sniper Wolf, and her story begins not in the cold of Alaska, but in the scorching heat of Iraqi Kurdistan, in a childhood marked by gunfire and genocide, in a life that transformed a traumatized refugee into one of the most skilled and tragic snipers in gaming history. When players first encountered Sniper Wolf in Metal Gear Solid back in 1998, they faced more than just a boss battle. They confronted a character whose depth and humanity would forever change how video games approached their antagonists. She was not simply an obstacle to overcome, not merely another enemy to defeat on the path to saving the world. She was a woman whose every action carried the weight of unspeakable trauma, whose skills as a sniper were forged in the fires of ethnic cleansing, whose loyalty to Big Boss stemmed from being saved when the entire world had abandoned her people to die. The sniper's duel on Shadow Moses Island stands as one of the most memorable moments in gaming history, not just for its tactical challenge, but for the emotional weight it carries. As Solid Snake peers through his scope across that snowfield, hunting for the woman who shot his companion Meryl, he has no idea that he is about to face someone whose pain runs deeper than any bullet could reach, whose story will force him to confront the human cost of the soldier's life, whose death will haunt not just him, but everyone who witnesses it. This is the complete story of Sniper Wolf. It is a story of survival against impossible odds, of skills honed through necessity rather than choice, of loyalty born from rescue when hope had died. It is a story of wolves, both the animals she cared for and the predatory nature forced upon her by circumstance. It is a story that begins in one of the 20th century's most horrific genocides and ends in a snowy field in Alaska, with a woman finally finding the peace she had been seeking all along. And it is a story that, more than 25 years after Metal Gear Solid's release, continues to resonate with players who recognize that some of gaming's most powerful moments come not from victory, but from understanding the humanity of those we are forced to fight. The Kurdish tragedy. To understand Sniper Wolf, we must first understand the world that created her. She was born sometime between 1976 and 1985 in Iraqi Kurdistan, a region that has known more than its share of suffering throughout the 20th century. The exact year of her birth remains unclear, lost to the chaos of war and displacement. But what we know for certain is that she entered a world already on fire, a world where being Kurdish meant being hunted, where childhood was measured not in years of innocence, but in days survived. The Kurdish people are one of the Middle East's largest ethnic groups without their own state, spread across Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Their history is marked by repeated betrayals, broken promises from world powers, and systematic attempts to erase their identity. In Iraq, the Kurdistan region in the north became a particular target of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime, which viewed Kurdish nationalism as a threat to Iraqi unity and took increasingly brutal measures to suppress it. Sniper Wolf's earliest memories were not of lullabies or bedtime stories, but of gunfire, sirens, and screams. These were the sounds that filled her nights, the backdrop against which her childhood played out. She would later describe these sounds as her lullabies, a haunting statement that reveals how thoroughly her innocence was stolen, how completely her understanding of normalcy was warped by the violence surrounding her. Where other children might have drifted to sleep, hearing their parents' voices or soft music, she fell asleep to the sounds of her people being hunted. The family she was born into lived in constant fear and constant motion. The Iraqi regime's attempts to hunt down Kurdish populations meant that staying in one place too long invited disaster. Shelters were temporary, ragged constructions that offered minimal protection from the elements and none from the soldiers who came looking for them. Each morning, when Sniper Wolf woke, she would often find that some of her family members or friends had died during the night, their bodies lying beside her, casualties of disease, starvation, or violence that came while she slept. Imagine being a child in such circumstances. Imagine waking up repeatedly to find death beside you, becoming so accustomed to it that you simply pray each morning to survive one more day. Imagine looking at the morning sun not with wonder at its beauty, but with desperate hope that you might live to see it again tomorrow. This was Sniper Wolf's reality, day after day, year after year. The psychological impact of such sustained trauma on a developing mind cannot be overstated. It creates a relationship with death that is fundamentally different from what most people experience. An acceptance of mortality that makes the act of killing, when it becomes necessary for survival, feel less like a violation of human nature and more like a continuation of the world as it has always been. But the worst was yet to come. When Sniper Wolf was approximately 8 years old, around 1988, the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein launched what would become known as the Al-Anfal campaign. The name comes from Surat Al-Anfal in the Quran, which translates roughly as the spoils of war. The Iraqi government twisted this religious terminology to describe a systematic campaign of genocide against the Kurdish population that would claim an estimated 50,000 to 182,000 lives, though the exact numbers remain disputed and the true toll may never be known. The Al-Anfal campaign was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence, but a carefully planned and methodically executed series of military operations designed to destroy Kurdish resistance and the Kurdish population that supported it. Ali Hassan al-Majid, a cousin of Saddam Hussein who earned the nickname Chemical Ali, was granted extraordinary powers equivalent to those of the president himself in the Kurdistan region. Under his command, the Iraqi military conducted 8 separate Anfal operations between February 23 and September 6, 1988. The pattern of these operations was horrifyingly consistent. First would come airstrikes and chemical weapons attacks. The Iraqi military used chemical weapons against civilian populations repeatedly during this period, the most infamous instance being the attack on Halabja on March 16, 1988, which killed approximately 5,000 people. The use of chemical weapons against civilians represented a level of brutality that shocked the international community, though not enough to prompt meaningful intervention. Following the chemical attacks and airstrikes came ground assaults. Iraqi troops would sweep through Kurdish villages and towns, rounding up civilians. The men and boys of so-called battle age, generally considered to be between 15 and 50 years old, were separated from the women, children, and elderly. These men were never seen again. Survivors later testified to mass executions, to being tied together and shot so that they would fall into pre-dug mass graves, to atrocities that fit the legal definition of genocide under international law. The women, children, and elderly who were not immediately killed faced their own horrors. They were sent to camps, places with names like Topzawa, Dibs, and Nugra Salman, where conditions were deliberately designed to be lethal. Overcrowding, lack of food and clean water, exposure to the elements, and the lingering effects of chemical weapons exposure killed hundreds, perhaps thousands more. These were not prisoner of war camps, but extermination facilities, places where the Iraqi regime could achieve through neglect and privation what it had not accomplished through direct murder. More than 4,000 Kurdish villages were destroyed during this period. Entire settlements were bulldozed, erasing not just the structures, but the very history of Kurdish presence in the region. Half of Iraq's productive farmland in Kurdish areas was laid waste. The regime sought not just to kill Kurds, but to eliminate any trace that they had ever lived there, to make the land itself forget them. Sniper Wolf witnessed the death of her family during this genocide. The specific circumstances are not entirely clear from available sources, but what we know is that when she was approximately 5 years old, she saw her family and thousands of others die in what was almost certainly a chemical weapons attack. The trauma of such an experience for a child that age defies description. Chemical weapons do not kill quickly or cleanly. They burn, they suffocate, they cause convulsions and vomiting and agonizing pain before death finally comes. To watch your parents, your siblings, your entire community die in such a manner would break most adults. For a 5-year-old child, it was a psychological wound that would never heal. The governments of the world, Sniper Wolf would later say with bitter accuracy, turned a blind eye to the Kurdish plight. The international community knew what was happening. Human Rights Watch would later compile extensive documentation of the genocide from captured Iraqi government documents. The United States State Department's Legal Bureau would conclude that the Anfal campaign met the legal definition of genocide under the 1948 Genocide Convention. But during the genocide itself, when intervention might have saved tens of thousands of lives, the world did nothing. The reason for this inaction was geopolitical calculation. Iraq was at war with Iran from 1980 to 1988, and Western powers, particularly the United States, saw Iraq as a bulwark against Iranian expansion. The fact that Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons against his own population was considered less important than maintaining Iraq as a counterweight to Iran. Kurdish lives were sacrificed on the altar of strategic interests. The Kurds were, as they had been so many times before in history, abandoned by those who had promised them support. For Sniper Wolf, this abandonment was personal and total. She survived the chemical attack that killed her family, but she was alone in a world that wanted her dead. The Iraqi regime was not finished with the Kurds, and those who survived the initial attacks found themselves hunted. Sniper Wolf, perhaps 8 years old at this point, was captured by Saddam's forces and taken by the Iraqi Ministry of Interior. What happened next represents another layer of trauma heaped upon an already broken child. The Ministry of Interior did not simply imprison her, they subjected her to brainwashing, attempting to erase her Kurdish identity and replace it with loyalty to the Iraqi state. The methods used in such brainwashing are not fully detailed in available sources, but they typically involve a combination of physical abuse, psychological manipulation, sleep deprivation, forced confessions, and constant propaganda. The goal is to break down the victim's sense of self and rebuild it in a form more useful to the authorities. But the Iraqi regime had an even more specific use for this traumatized Kurdish girl. They brought in a famed Gurkha sniper to train her as a child combatant for the government. The Gurkhas are renowned military forces from Nepal, known for their exceptional skill and discipline. That the Iraqi regime would recruit a Gurkha sniper specifically to train a child soldier speaks to both the value they placed on creating highly skilled assets and the depths of their cruelty. They were taking a child who had already witnessed unspeakable horrors and deliberately turning her into a weapon. The training she received was undoubtedly rigorous and brutal. Sniping is one of the most demanding military disciplines, requiring not just marksmanship but patience, fieldcraft, the ability to remain still and alert for extended periods, and a psychological capacity to take human life from a distance while looking directly at your target through a scope. To instill these qualities in a child required breaking down whatever remained of her humanity and rebuilding her as a killing instrument. The Iraqi regime succeeded in this task, creating a child soldier with exceptional skills. For 3 years, from approximately 1988 to 1991, Sniper Wolf served as a child combatant for the very government that had massacred her people. This fact is one of the most tragic aspects of her story. The brainwashing was effective enough that she fought for those who had killed her family, her identity so thoroughly erased that she could be turned against her own. It is a testament to the effectiveness of the psychological torture she endured and a stark reminder of how thoroughly totalitarian regimes can warp human nature when they have absolute power over their victims. But in 1991, everything changed. Following Iraq's defeat in the First Gulf War, uprisings broke out across the country, including in Kurdistan. The Iraqi regime, weakened by its military defeat at the hands of the coalition forces, lost control of significant portions of the north. Kurdish forces, sensing an opportunity, seized control of many areas. The Iraqi military infrastructure that had held Sniper Wolf in its grip crumbled, at least temporarily. During this chaos, Sniper Wolf escaped. How exactly she managed this escape is not detailed in available sources, but she fled to a Kurdish refugee camp. After years of brainwashing and forced service to those who had committed genocide against her people, she was finally free. But freedom for a 13-year-old girl who had known nothing but war and training as a sniper was not the liberation it might sound like. She was alone, traumatized beyond measure, still carrying the psychological conditioning that had made her a child soldier and living in a refugee camp where thousands of other Kurds struggled to survive with minimal resources and no real hope for the future. It was in this refugee camp, in what should have been the absolute nadir of her existence, that Sniper Wolf's life changed forever. It was here that a legendary American soldier noticed her extraordinary abilities and offered her something she had never known: rescue, purpose, and a reason to keep living. His name was Big Boss, though she would come to know him by another name, one that carried deep cultural significance for a Kurdish woman who had lost everything. She would call him Saladin. The man who would become Sniper Wolf's savior was already a legend by the time he found her in that Kurdish refugee camp in 1991. Big Boss, real name John, was a Special Forces operative whose career had taken him through some of the most significant covert operations of the Cold War era. He had founded Special Forces units, fought in conflicts across the globe, and by this point in his life had already established Outer Heaven, his own mercenary state in Africa, and later Zanzibar land. His life was complicated, his loyalties often ambiguous, but his skill as a soldier was beyond question. Exactly what brought Big Boss to Kurdistan in 1991 remains somewhat unclear. Some sources suggest it was the real Big Boss, John himself, who rescued her. Others theorize it might have been Venom Snake, his body double, who was operating in similar regions during this period and conducting rescue operations. Still others have suggested it could have been Solidus Snake, who was training child soldiers in Africa around this time. The most commonly accepted interpretation, and the one most consistent with Sniper Wolf's own statements, is that it was indeed the real Big Boss who found her. What is certain is that whoever this soldier was, Sniper Wolf knew him as Big Boss, and his intervention in her life was total and transformative. He noticed her extraordinary abilities even in the refugee camp. Despite her age and circumstances, she carried herself differently from other refugees. The training she had received from the Gurkha sniper, combined with her experiences as a child combatant, gave her a bearing that would have been recognizable to an experienced Special Forces operator like Big Boss. She was not just another traumatized refugee. She was a weapon that had been forged in the worst possible way, and Big Boss saw potential where others might have seen only a broken child. Big Boss brought Sniper Wolf with him to the United States. This decision was not made lightly, and it speaks to the complex character of Big Boss himself. He was a man capable of great violence and manipulation, someone who would eventually be remembered as much for his betrayals as for his heroism. Yet he also possessed a code of honor, a recognition of warrior spirit wherever he found it, and perhaps a desire to save at least one person from the machinery of war that he himself had helped to perpetuate. In the United States, Sniper Wolf received counseling and deprogramming designed to remove the Iraqi brainwashing. This process was likely extensive and difficult. Deprogramming someone who has been subjected to systematic psychological conditioning requires careful work by trained professionals. The goal was not to erase her memories or pretend the trauma had never happened, but to help her understand what had been done to her, to separate the propaganda from reality, and to give her back some measure of control over her own mind. The fact that she retained her fighting abilities while the brainwashing was removed suggests a deliberate choice in the deprogramming process. Big Boss did not want to destroy what she had become, only to redirect it. He recognized that her skills as a sniper were extraordinary, honed through the kind of training and real-world experience that could not be replicated in any conventional military program. Rather than trying to turn her into a normal teenage girl, which would have been impossible anyway, given everything she had experienced, he chose to preserve her capabilities while giving her agency over how to use them. Under Big Boss's tutelage, Sniper Wolf's skills reached new heights. She learned to remain in position for days or even weeks without moving, eating, or sleeping. This level of endurance is almost superhuman, requiring not just physical conditioning, but a psychological state that most people cannot achieve. Snipers often work in teams, with a spotter assisting the shooter. But Sniper Wolf worked alone, preferring to trust only herself for both reconnaissance and the shot itself. She became particularly adept in sand and snow environments, two of the most challenging terrains for sniping. Sand creates heat shimmer that distorts vision, shifts constantly underfoot, and gets into every mechanism. Snow blinds through its brightness, makes concealment difficult through the contrast it creates, and poses constant threats of hypothermia. That Sniper Wolf excelled in both these environments speaks to her exceptional training and innate talent. But perhaps most importantly, Big Boss gave Sniper Wolf something she had never possessed: loyalty freely given rather than extracted through torture. She revered him, seeing in him not just a teacher or commanding officer, but a savior who had appeared when the entire world had abandoned her people. She gave him a name that carried profound cultural and historical significance. She called him Saladin. Saladin, or Salah ad-Din, was a 12th century Kurdish Muslim military leader who became Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He is best known in Western history for his role in the Crusades, particularly for recapturing Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187. But for Kurds, Saladin holds even deeper significance. He represents one of the most successful Kurdish leaders in history, a man who rose from relatively humble origins to become one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world, while maintaining his Kurdish identity. Saladin is also renowned for his chivalry, his mercy toward defeated enemies, and his adherence to a code of honor even in the midst of brutal warfare. Richard the Lionheart, his great adversary during the Third Crusade, spoke of Saladin with respect and admiration despite being his enemy. This combination of military prowess, cultural pride, and honorable conduct made Saladin an ideal hero figure for Kurds, representing what they aspired to be and what they had been prevented from becoming by centuries of oppression. When Sniper Wolf called Big Boss by this name, she was making a statement about who he was to her. He was her hero in the most literal sense, the man who had saved her when salvation seemed impossible. He was someone who had noticed her and her people when the entire world had turned its back. He was, like Saladin, a warrior of exceptional skill who operated by his own code rather than simply following orders. And perhaps most significantly, he represented a connection to her Kurdish heritage, a reminder that her people had once produced leaders like Saladin and could do so again. The relationship between Big Boss and Sniper Wolf was complex, mixing elements of father-daughter, teacher-student, and commander-subordinate dynamics. He trained her, protected her, and gave her purpose. She followed him with absolute devotion, becoming one of his most skilled disciples. When other soldiers might question orders or pursue their own agendas, Sniper Wolf remained utterly loyal to the man she called Saladin. This loyalty would persist even after Big Boss's apparent death. According to the timeline of Metal Gear Solid, Big Boss was defeated by Solid Snake in Zanzibar Land in 1999 and was believed to have died from his injuries, though players later learned he survived in a coma. For Sniper Wolf, this loss was devastating. The one person who had given meaning to her life, who had transformed her from a broken child soldier into a skilled warrior with purpose, was gone. In the wake of Big Boss's presumed death, Sniper Wolf was later recruited into FOXHOUND, the elite special forces unit that Big Boss himself had once commanded. This decision made sense on multiple levels. FOXHOUND sought the best soldiers in the world, and Sniper Wolf's skills were undeniable. She had been trained by one of their founders' greatest students and by Big Boss himself. Her abilities as a lone sniper were without peer, and for Sniper Wolf herself, joining FOXHOUND meant continuing to honor the memory and legacy of the man who had saved her. But she joined with bitterness in her heart and vengeance on her mind. The world's governments, those same powers that had turned a blind eye to the Kurdish genocide, that had abandoned her people to die, that had done nothing while children like her were orphaned and traumatized, would finally face consequences. Shadow Moses Island would become the stage for her reckoning, though she could not have known that it would also become the place where her story would end. To understand what made Sniper Wolf such a formidable opponent, we must understand the art of sniping itself and how she had mastered it beyond what most military professionals achieve in a lifetime of service. Sniping is not simply about being able to shoot accurately at long range, though that is certainly a critical component. It is about patience, fieldcraft, understanding of ballistics and weather, psychological fortitude, and the ability to make split-second decisions after hours or days of waiting. Sniper Wolf's weapon of choice was the Heckler & Koch PSG-1, a semi-automatic sniper rifle that represented the pinnacle of precision firearms when Metal Gear Solid was set. The PSG-1, whose designation stands for Präzisionsschützengewehr or precision shooter rifle, was designed specifically for law enforcement and counter-terrorism applications by the German arms manufacturer Heckler & Koch. Chambered in 7.62 by 51 mm NATO rounds, the PSG-1 was renowned for its accuracy, capable of grouping shots within a remarkably small area, even at ranges exceeding 800 meters. The rifle fed from either 5 or 20-round box magazines, and its semi-automatic operation meant that follow-up shots could be taken quickly without the need to manually cycle a bolt action. This capability was particularly useful in Sniper Wolf's preferred mode of operation, working alone without a spotter. If her first shot did not neutralize the target, she could quickly fire again without losing sight picture or having to operate a bolt mechanism. However, the PSG-1 had one significant drawback that limited its military adoption: cost. Each rifle was extraordinarily expensive to manufacture due to its precision components and hand-fitted parts. Only the wealthiest law enforcement agencies could afford to equip their snipers with PSG-1s. Military forces generally opted for cheaper alternatives like the MSG-90, which was based on the same basic platform but built to less exacting specifications. The PSG-1 also had a peculiarity in how far it spent casings ejected, which could potentially give away a sniper's position in a military context, though this was less of a concern for the police sharpshooter role it was designed for. That Sniper Wolf used the PSG-1 spoke to the resources available to FOXHOUND and to her own preferences. She chose this weapon not because it was standard issue, but because it matched her needs perfectly. The accuracy was unparalleled, the semi-automatic operation suited her lone wolf approach, and the weight and balance of the weapon were ideally suited to her physical frame and shooting style. But Sniper Wolf's bullets themselves were what made her truly lethal. According to several sources, she used mercury-tipped hollow-point rounds. This detail is particularly grim. Mercury is highly toxic to humans, and a bullet that released mercury into a wound would poison the victim even if the shot itself was not immediately fatal. The hollow-point design meant the rounds would expand upon impact, causing maximum tissue damage and increasing the likelihood that mercury would be distributed throughout the wound cavity. The use of such ammunition suggests a deliberate choice to maximize lethality even with non-ideal shot placement. If Sniper Wolf wounded rather than killed a target, the mercury poisoning would likely finish what the bullet started. This might seem unnecessarily cruel, but from a tactical perspective, it made sense for someone who worked alone. If she wounded an enemy who then managed to reach medical care, traditional bullets might allow them to survive and provide intelligence about her position or tactics. Mercury-poisoned wounds eliminated that possibility. The reference to mercury bullets might also be a nod to the novel Day of the Jackal by Frederick Forsyth, where mercury-filled bullets are mentioned as a way to ensure a kill. Hideo Kojima, the creator of Metal Gear Solid, frequently included literary references in his games, and this would fit that pattern. Beyond her weapon, Sniper Wolf's most remarkable attribute was her patience. The ability to remain in position for days or weeks without moving is almost incomprehensible to anyone who has not experienced similar training. The human body is not designed for such immobility. Muscles cramp, joints stiffen, circulation becomes poor. The mind wanders, and the urge to move becomes almost unbearable. Yet Sniper Wolf could suppress all these natural responses, maintaining absolute stillness and alertness for extended periods. This capability was partly natural talent, partly the result of her training from both the Gurkha sniper and Big Boss, and partly a consequence of her psychological conditioning. Someone who grew up hiding from soldiers hunting her people, who survived by remaining absolutely silent and still while death passed nearby, would have developed an innate understanding of the importance of immobility. Her childhood had taught her that movement meant death, and that lesson was reinforced through years of the most intensive sniper training available. But there was another factor that contributed to Sniper Wolf's supernatural steadiness: her addiction to diazepam. Diazepam is a benzodiazepine medication commonly known by the brand name Valium. It is used to treat anxiety disorders, muscle spasms, and seizures. For a sniper, diazepam offers specific advantages. It calms the mind, reducing the psychological stress that can cause shaking or loss of focus. It relaxes muscles, preventing spasms and reducing the micro-tremors that all humans experience and that can throw off a precision shot. It slows the heart rate, which is particularly important for snipers because the pulse creates a rhythmic movement throughout the body that can affect aim. Sniper Wolf was addicted to this drug, taking it regularly to enhance her accuracy. The game itself acknowledged this, with diazepam appearing as an item that Solid Snake could use to steady his aim when using sniper rifles. The fact that she needed chemical assistance to maintain her legendary steadiness suggests that even her exceptional natural abilities and training required augmentation to reach the levels she achieved. Interestingly, Liquid Snake, the leader of the FOXHOUND revolt at Shadow Moses, speculated that Sniper Wolf's diazepam saturation might have been why she was immune to Fox Dye, the targeted bioweapon that killed several other members of FOXHOUND during the Shadow Moses incident. Whether this theory was accurate or simply liquid speculation is unclear, but it points to just how thoroughly the drug had become integrated into her physiology. Despite her reliance on diazepam, Sniper Wolf was not simply a pharmaceutical-enhanced marksman. Her skills were genuine and extraordinary. She possessed an intuitive understanding of ballistics, able to compensate for wind, bullet drop, temperature, humidity, and all the other factors that affect a bullet's trajectory over long distances. She could read terrain, finding positions that offered optimal sightlines while minimizing her exposure. She understood fieldcraft, the art of camouflage and concealment that allowed her to disappear into her environment. Most unusually, especially for a professional sniper, Sniper Wolf formed emotional connections with her targets before killing them. Revolver Ocelot, another member of FOXHOUND, explained that she would sometimes fall in love with the men she was assigned to kill, studying them for days or weeks, learning their patterns, understanding who they were as people, before finally pulling the trigger. This psychological characteristic sets her apart from typical military snipers, who are trained to dehumanize their targets to make the act of killing psychologically easier. For Sniper Wolf, the act of killing was perhaps too easy, so familiar from her childhood that it lacked the moral weight it should have carried. By forcing herself to see her targets as human beings, to understand and even love them in some abstract way, she was perhaps trying to restore meaning to acts of violence that had become routine. It was her way of honoring the humanity of those she killed, of acknowledging that each death mattered, even as she pulled the trigger again and again. Yet despite this capacity for emotional connection, Sniper Wolf also maintained certain ethical boundaries within her profession. According to available sources, she disliked killing women and children. This preference makes sense given her own experiences as a child caught in violence, and it reveals that beneath the cold efficiency of the sniper lay someone who still remembered what it was like to be vulnerable and helpless. She killed because she was trained to kill, because she was loyal to those who commanded her, because killing was what she knew how to do. But she did not kill indiscriminately or take pleasure in the suffering of innocents. Her relationship with wolves and wolf dogs represents another dimension of her character. Unlike most members of FOXHOUND who were named after animals primarily for their code names, Sniper Wolf had a genuine affinity for the creatures that shared her name. When Liquid Snake planned to have the wolf dogs on Shadow Moses Island destroyed, Sniper Wolf refused to allow it. She cared for them, saw something of herself in these animals that were neither fully wild nor fully domesticated, caught between two worlds just as she was caught between her Kurdish heritage and her role as an American Special Forces operative. The wolves became companions in a life otherwise defined by solitude. Snipers, by necessity, often work alone. The job requires patience and silence that make conversation impossible. The need for concealment means avoiding other people. The psychological burden of taking human life from a distance, of watching someone die through a scope, of being unable to ever fully explain what that experience is like to those who have not lived it, creates a gulf between snipers and other soldiers. Sniper Wolf had chosen this path perhaps because solitude was what she knew best, because she had survived her childhood by trusting no one and needing no one, because wolves like her worked best alone. But even wolves need packs sometimes. For Sniper Wolf, the wolf dogs on Shadow Moses became that pack. Creatures she could care for without having to explain herself, companions who asked nothing of her except food and affection, beings whose presence reminded her that despite everything she had become, some capacity for gentleness still remained within her. By 2005, Sniper Wolf had established herself as one of the most formidable members of FOXHOUND, the elite special forces unit that represented the pinnacle of American military capability. FOXHOUND had been founded by Big Boss himself years earlier, designed to handle missions that conventional forces could not. Operations that required not just exceptional skill, but the kind of soldiers who could operate with minimal support in any environment against any enemy. The unit's name, FOXHOUND, referred to a breed of hunting dog known for persistence and keen senses, qualities that the unit's members were expected to embody. The FOXHOUND that Sniper Wolf joined was not the same organization that Big Boss had created. After his apparent death and the Shadow Moses incident that preceded Metal Gear Solid, the unit had been reformed under new leadership. Liquid Snake, one of the clones of Big Boss created through the Les Enfants Terribles project, had assumed command of FOXHOUND and had recruited his own team, each member possessing supernatural abilities or exceptional skills that made them legends in the Special Forces community. This new FOXHOUND included some of the most dangerous individuals alive. Revolver Ocelot, a Russian gunslinger with extraordinary reflexes and deep ties to multiple intelligence agencies. Psycho Mantis, a psychic whose mental powers allowed him to read minds and control others. Vulcan Raven, an enormous Inuk shaman who wielded a massive Vulcan cannon and possessed intuitive abilities. Decoy Octopus, a master of disguise capable of impersonating anyone perfectly. And Sniper Wolf, whose skills with a rifle were without equal. These individuals were called the Sons of Big Boss, and they shared more than just exceptional abilities. They had all, in various ways, been shaped by Big Boss or his legacy. For Sniper Wolf specifically, being part of FOXHOUND meant honoring the memory of the man who had saved her, carrying forward the military excellence he represented, and using the skills he had helped her develop in service of what she believed was a worthy cause. That cause, as it turned out, was not the American government's interests. In February 2005, FOXHOUND went rogue. Under Liquid Snake's leadership, they seized control of Shadow Moses Island, a remote facility in Alaska's Fox Archipelago that served as a nuclear weapons disposal site and secret development center for military technology. The facility housed the next-generation Metal Gear, a bipedal nuclear-equipped tank designated REX, along with nuclear warheads that were supposedly being decommissioned. The rogue FOXHOUND unit took hostages, including Armstech Corporation President Kenneth Baker and DARPA Chief Donald Anderson, as well as numerous workers at the facility. They made demands to the United States government, deliver the remains of Big Boss within 24 hours, or they would launch a nuclear weapon. Their threat was credible. Metal Gear Rex was operational, and with its railgun capable of launching nuclear warheads that could not be detected or intercepted by existing defense systems, they possessed the ability to strike any target on Earth with impunity. But the public demands masked deeper motivations. Liquid Snake's true goal was to obtain Big Boss's genetic material to cure a genetic deficiency he believed he possessed, a flaw he thought made him inferior to his brother Solid Snake. He also sought to establish Outer Heaven, the mercenary state that Big Boss had envisioned, continuing his genetic father's dream of creating a world where soldiers were not simply tools of governments, but could determine their own destinies. For Sniper Wolf, however, the motivation was different and far more personal. She joined the Shadow Moses uprising, driven by a desire for revenge against the world's governments for their neglect of the Kurdish people during their time of greatest need. When Chemical Ali was gassing her villages, when Iraqi forces were rounding up her people for mass execution, when the Al-Anfal campaign was systematically attempting to erase Kurdish existence from the face of the earth, the international community did nothing. The governments that now demanded FOXHOUND stand down were the same governments that had abandoned the Kurds to genocide. Shadow Moses was not simply a terrorist takeover for Sniper Wolf. It was a reckoning, a way of forcing the world to pay attention, a means of showing that Kurdish lives mattered and that there would be consequences for forgetting them. She knew the operation would likely end in her death. She was, after all, a realist about the odds they faced. But death had been her companion since childhood, and if she could die striking back at those who had let her people suffer, perhaps there was meaning in that. The uprising began in late February 2005, and by February 28th, FOXHOUND had secured complete control of Shadow Moses Island. Among the elements of their control was the facility's population of wolf dogs. Liquid Snake, ever pragmatic, saw these animals as unnecessary mouths to feed and potential complications. He ordered them destroyed. Sniper Wolf refused to allow it. In perhaps the most humanizing detail about her character, she insisted on preserving the lives of these animals who had no part in human conflicts, who were innocent in ways that soldiers could never be. Liquid, recognizing both her skill and the importance of maintaining her loyalty, allowed her this exception. The wolf dogs would live, and Sniper Wolf would personally care for them. In this decision, we see the core contradiction of Sniper Wolf's character. She was a woman capable of killing with cold efficiency, a sniper who had taken countless lives, someone who had been trained and conditioned to be a weapon. Yet she possessed compassion for these animals, seeing in them something worth protecting. The wolf dogs were hybrids, crosses between wild wolves and domestic huskies, neither one thing nor the other. They were like her, caught between worlds, products of forces beyond their control, surviving by adapting to circumstances that should have destroyed them. Among the hostages held at Shadow Moses was Dr. Hal Emmerich, better known by his nickname Otacon, a brilliant scientist who had designed Metal Gear Rex without fully understanding its true purpose. Emmerich was a complex individual himself, a man driven by dreams of creating robots like those in the anime he loved, only to discover that his work had been used to create a nuclear weapon of unprecedented power. He was guilt-ridden, terrified, and completely out of his depth in the violent world he suddenly found himself inhabiting. Sniper Wolf allowed Otacon to feed the wolf dogs. This simple act of kindness, this small gesture of trust toward a prisoner, revealed something important about her. She was not simply a terrorist, not just a soldier following orders, not merely a weapon to be aimed and fired by Liquid Snake. She retained the capacity for mercy, for recognizing innocence when she saw it, for extending kindness even in the midst of an operation designed to threaten nuclear apocalypse. Otacon, for his part, became infatuated with Sniper Wolf. The exact nature of his feelings is complicated, and some have suggested it was Stockholm Syndrome, the psychological phenomenon where hostages develop positive feelings toward their captors. But it seems to have been more than that. Otacon saw in Sniper Wolf someone who, like him, possessed gentleness beneath a dangerous exterior. He saw her kindness to the wolves and interpreted it, perhaps not incorrectly, as evidence of goodness in someone forced by circumstance into a role that required her to do terrible things. As a token of this connection, Sniper Wolf gave Otacon her handkerchief. This small piece of fabric would become one of the most significant items in Metal Gear Solid, carrying her scent and later allowing Solid Snake to calm the wolf dogs who would otherwise attack him. But more than its practical utility, the handkerchief represented the possibility of human connection even in the most inhuman circumstances. The idea that even a sniper waiting for her shot and a scientist held hostage could recognize each other's humanity. Sniper Wolf's position at Shadow Moses was both tactical and symbolic. As FOXHOUND sniper, she served as a critical component of their defense. Her ability to cover approaches to the facility, to eliminate threats from a distance, to monitor for incoming enemies made her invaluable. But she also embodied one of the operation's core purposes, to demonstrate FOXHOUND's lethality, to show that they were not bluffing, to prove that crossing them would have deadly consequences. When Solid Snake infiltrated Shadow Moses Island on the evening of February 28th, sent by the Pentagon to rescue the hostages and neutralize the FOXHOUND threat, he had no idea he was walking into a carefully constructed scenario. The terrorists were not simply terrorists. The hostage rescue was not simply a rescue. The entire situation had been orchestrated by forces operating behind the scenes, using FOXHOUND and Snake as pawns in a larger game. But none of that would become clear until later. In that moment, as Snake moved through the facility trying to reach the hostages, he was simply a soldier doing his job. And in that moment, Sniper Wolf was waiting for him, patient as she had been trained to be. steady as the diazepam in her system allowed, ready to face the legendary Solid Snake, the man who had defeated Big Boss himself. She had heard about Snake, of course. Everyone in FOXHOUND had. He was the soldier who had saved the world twice already, infiltrating Outer Heaven and Zanzibar land, destroying the Metal Gears before they could be used, preventing nuclear catastrophes through skill and determination that bordered on the supernatural. But Sniper Wolf was not intimidated. She had faced death every day of her childhood. She had killed men who were just as dangerous, just as skilled. She had been trained by Big Boss himself, and if this clone of him thought he could simply walk through Shadow Moses and destroy everything they had planned, he would learn that some students surpass their teachers. The stage was set for one of gaming's most memorable confrontations. The wolf waited in the snow, and the snake moved through the darkness toward her, neither of them fully understanding that their duel would become legendary, that the moments they were about to experience would resonate with players for decades to come, that Sniper Wolf's death would prove to be one of the most emotionally powerful scenes ever created in an interactive medium. Snow fell heavy across Shadow Moses Island as Solid Snake made his way through the military facility, moving from shadow to shadow with the practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of infiltration countless times before. He had already disabled several guard patrols, navigated security systems, and begun piecing together the true nature of what was happening at the isolated Alaskan base. But as he approached the communication towers, working his way through the facility with Colonel Roy Campbell's guidance via codec, he had no idea that the most dangerous member of FOXHOUND was watching him through a scope, calculating windage and elevation, waiting for the perfect moment to take her shot. Snake was not alone in his approach to the towers. Meryl Silverburr, Colonel Campbell's niece, had joined him during his infiltration. Meryl was a young soldier, eager to prove herself in combat, motivated by a desire to be more than just the colonel's relative, but to earn her place as a soldier through her own merit. She had helped Snake navigate parts of the facility, fought alongside him, and formed a connection with the legendary operative that suggested the possibility of something beyond the professional. They moved through an underground passage, heading toward the communication towers that were crucial to FOXHOUND's control of the island. The passage was quiet, too quiet for a facility that was supposedly on high alert. Snake's instincts should have warned him that something was wrong, that the absence of guards meant they were being funneled toward a specific location for a specific reason. But he pressed forward, Meryl at his side, both of them focused on their mission. They emerged from the underground passage into the area near the communication towers. The snow had increased, creating a white haze that limited visibility, but not enough to provide real concealment. Meryl moved ahead slightly, scanning the area, her weapon ready. Snake followed, alert but not yet aware of the trap they were walking into. The shot came without warning. One moment Meryl was moving forward, and the next she was down, crying out in pain, blood spreading across the snow from a wound in her thigh. The shot had been deliberately non-lethal, placed to wound rather than kill. A message from the sniper that she could have killed Meryl easily if she had wanted to, but had chosen not to. This was not mere marksmanship. It was a demonstration, a statement, a lure. Snake immediately took cover, dragging Meryl with him, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The shot had come from a distance, from an elevated position, from someone with exceptional skill. This was not a guard who had gotten lucky. This was a professional, someone who knew exactly what she was doing, someone who had deliberately wounded Meryl to draw Snake out. Through his codec, Snake received confirmation of what he had already guessed. This was Sniper Wolf, FOXHOUND's premier marksman, a woman whose skills made her one of the most dangerous members of the rogue unit. Colonel Campbell explained that Snake would need to retrieve a sniper rifle of his own if he hoped to face her on equal terms. Engaging a sniper at range with an assault rifle or pistol was suicide. He needed the PSG-1. But first, Meryl needed medical attention. The wound in her leg was serious, bleeding heavily, and she was going into shock. Snake did what he could for her in the moment, but he knew she needed real medical care, the kind he could not provide in the field. He had to leave her, had to go for the rifle, had to confront the sniper who had put her down. It was a tactical necessity, but that did not make it any easier. Snake moved carefully through the facility, making his way to the armory where the PSG-1 was stored. The journey took him through areas now heavily guarded, past surveillance systems that had been activated in his absence, through minefields that had been laid specifically to slow him down. FOXHOUND knew where he needed to go and had turned the route into a gauntlet. But Snake had faced worse, had survived missions that should have killed him, and he was not going to be stopped by guards and mines. In the armory, secured in a weapons locker, he found the PSG-1. The rifle was heavy, precise, a tool designed for killing at distances where the target could not fight back. Snake was not primarily a sniper, but he had received training in long-range marksmanship during his time in FOXHOUND and the CIA. He understood the fundamentals, knew how to compensate for wind and distance, possessed the steady hands and nerves necessary for precision shooting. But he was about to face someone for whom sniping was not just a skill, but a way of life, someone who had been doing this since she was a child. Snake also acquired diazepam, the same drug that Sniper Wolf used to steady her aim. The psychological irony of this was not lost on him. He was using her own methods to fight her, adopting the chemical assistance she relied on, becoming in a small way more like the woman he was hunting. The drug would help steady his aim, reduce the natural tremor in his hands, slow his heart rate. Against an opponent like Sniper Wolf, he needed every advantage he could get. The trek back to the communication towers was nerve-wracking. Snake knew that Sniper Wolf had likely been tracking him, that she had watched him go for the rifle, that she would be ready for his return. She had all the advantages. She had been in position for who knew how long, she knew the terrain intimately, she had chosen her spot carefully, picking a location that gave her sight lines across the entire area while minimizing her exposure. She was the hunter, and Snake was walking back into her kill zone. The area near the communication towers was a nightmare for anyone being hunted by a sniper. It was relatively open, offering limited cover, and the snow limited visibility in ways that worked to the sniper's advantage. Snake could not see clearly at distance, but Sniper Wolf's scope would cut through the weather conditions. Every time Snake moved, every time he exposed himself even slightly, she would have a shot. The duel began in silence. Snake moved from cover to cover, trying to spot Sniper Wolf's position while avoiding giving her a clear shot at him. He used his own scope, scanning the towers and elevated positions, looking for any sign of movement, any glint of light off glass, any disturbed snow that might indicate where she was hiding. For several minutes, neither of them fired. It was a game of patience, the fundamental test of any sniper duel, seeing who would lose composure first and make the mistake that the other could exploit. Sniper Wolf taunted him over the codec, her voice cold but not without a certain amusement. She asked if he could sense her near him, told him she was going to send him what she called a love letter, meaning a bullet aimed straight at his heart. Her psychological warfare was subtle but effective, designed to put him off balance, to make him rush his shot, to force him into a mistake. She was not just trying to kill him, she was trying to dominate him mentally, to prove that she was the superior sniper, that his reputation meant nothing against her skill. Snake did not respond to her taunts. He focused on his breathing, on controlling his heart rate, on waiting for the moment when she would have to expose herself. Snipers cannot remain hidden indefinitely. At some point, they have to adjust position or acquire their target through their scope or take their shot. In that moment of exposure, there is a window, sometimes only fractions of a second, where a skilled opponent can return fire. When Snake finally spotted her, it was through a combination of patience and skill. A slight disturbance in the snow, a brief glint from her scope, the smallest suggestion of movement. He brought his PSG-1 to bear, compensated for distance and wind, controlled his breathing, and fired. The shot caught Sniper Wolf, but it was not a kill shot. She had moved at the last instant, her own instincts warning her, and what should have been a fatal hit instead became a wound. But the duel was not over. Both snipers knew that wounding was sometimes as good as killing in their profession. A wounded sniper could not hold her position, could not maintain the steady aim required for precision shooting. Snake pressed his advantage, moving to a better position, taking another shot, and then another. Each time he was getting closer to a kill, and each time Sniper Wolf was being driven from her position. Finally, after several exchanges of fire, Snake landed a shot that ended the duel. Sniper Wolf went down, and the area fell silent. Snake approached carefully, his rifle still raised, knowing that a wounded sniper was still dangerous, that she might have enough strength left for one final shot. But as he drew closer, he saw that she was down and not getting back up. Or so he thought. What Snake did not know was that this entire encounter had been a setup. Sniper Wolf had deliberately allowed herself to be wounded, had let Snake think he had won the duel, had positioned FOXHOUND soldiers nearby to capitalize on his moment of assumed victory. As Snake moved forward to check on Merrill and ensure the area was secure, he was suddenly surrounded. Sniper Wolf had marked him, not with a bullet but with her blood, leaving a scratch on his face as a signature of the encounter. Then guards moved in, overwhelming him through numbers, and Snake was captured. The blow to his pride must have been severe. He had fought well, had proven himself capable against one of the world's best snipers, and yet it had all been a ruse, a way to get him close enough that conventional soldiers could overwhelm him. Sniper Wolf had never intended to win through sniping alone. She had used her skills as a sniper to set up his capture, demonstrating a tactical sophistication that went beyond mere marksmanship. Snake was knocked unconscious and dragged away to a torture chamber, where Revolver Ocelot would begin the brutal interrogation that would become one of Metal Gear Solid's most infamous gameplay sequences. Merrill was taken as well, held hostage to ensure Snake's compliance. FOXHOUND had won this round, and Sniper Wolf had proven that her reputation was entirely justified. She was not just a skilled marksman, but a tactical thinker who understood that killing was not always the best use of a sniper's abilities. For Sniper Wolf, this victory was bittersweet. She had succeeded in capturing Snake, had demonstrated her superiority as a sniper, had proven that the legendary Solid Snake was not invincible, but in doing so, she had set in motion events that would ultimately lead to her own death. Because Snake was not simply any soldier, he was a man who had never accepted defeat, who had escaped from situations that should have been inescapable, who had a way of turning impossible odds into improbable victories. And the next time they met, in a snowy field far from the communication towers, there would be no tricks, no setups, no guards waiting in reserve. It would be just the two of them, sniper against sniper, and only one would walk away alive. Solid Snake's escape from captivity was the kind of feat that had made him legendary. Through a combination of skill, improvisation, assistance from inside sources, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat, he fought his way out of the torture chamber where Revolver Ocelot had been attempting to break him. The escape was not easy. Snake was exhausted, injured, pushed to the limits of his endurance. But he was free, and he still had a mission to complete. During his captivity, Hal Emmerich, the scientist better known as Otacon, had provided Snake with materials to aid his escape. Among these was the handkerchief that Sniper Wolf had given to Otacon, the small piece of cloth that carried her scent. Otacon perhaps did not fully understand why he was compelled to give this to Snake, what forces of fate were moving him to provide the legendary soldier with an item connected to the woman he had developed feelings for. But he did it nonetheless, setting in motion the events that would lead to their final confrontation. After escaping, Snake continued his mission, fighting his way through FOXHOUND's forces, learning more about the conspiracy behind the Shadow Moses incident, uncovering layers of deception that went far deeper than a simple terrorist takeover. He battled Liquid Snake in a Hind D attack helicopter, using a Stinger missile launcher to bring down the aircraft in a spectacular display of combat prowess. He descended from the communication tower, one of the structures where he had first dueled Sniper Wolf, and began making his way toward the blast furnace and the underground base where Metal Gear REX was being held. But to reach those objectives, he had to pass through a snowfield between the tower and the underground warehouse. A large open area with minimal cover, exposed to the elements, visible from multiple elevated positions. It was sniper country, the kind of terrain that made infantry soldiers nervous and gave marksmen clear fields of fire. Sniper Wolf was waiting for him there. She had known he would come this way. The layout of the facility dictated his route. He had to pass through this area to reach his objectives, and she had positioned herself perfectly to intercept him. This time, there would be no tricks, no ambushes, no backup forces waiting to capture him. This was to be a pure contest of sniping skill, two of the best in the world facing each other with nothing but their rifles, their training, and their will to survive. The snowfield was larger than the area where they had first fought, offering more space to maneuver, but also more exposure. The weather was worse too, with heavier snow falling, creating visibility problems that would challenge even the most skilled snipers. The cold was intense, threatening hypothermia for anyone who stayed still too long. Though for Sniper Wolf, who had been in position waiting for who knew how long, the cold was simply another factor to endure, another test of her will and conditioning. Snake entered the area cautiously, his PSG-1 ready, knowing that Sniper Wolf was somewhere in this expanse, but not knowing exactly where. He moved from cover to cover, using what limited concealment the terrain provided, scanning with his scope for any sign of his opponent. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind and the soft crunch of snow under his boots. Then her voice came over his codec, cutting through the silence with words that were almost conversational. She spoke to him as if they were old friends meeting again, asked if he was ready for this, reminded him of what was at stake. There was something different in her tone now, something that suggested she knew this was the end, that one way or another, their story was about to reach its conclusion. Otacon broke into the codec transmission, his voice desperate and pleading. He begged Snake not to kill her, told him that she was not a bad person, that she had been kind to him, that she did not deserve to die. The genuine emotion in Otacon's voice was heartbreaking. He had developed real feelings for Sniper Wolf, and the thought of Snake killing her was tearing him apart. But Snake could not let sentiment compromise his mission. Meryl was still being held hostage. The nuclear threat was still active. Metal Gear REX was still operational. He had to get through this area, and Sniper Wolf was in his way. The duel began in earnest, and it was everything a sniper battle should be. Patience, precision, psychology, and positioning all played their parts. Snake would spot Sniper Wolf's position, take a shot, and then have to relocate immediately before she could return fire. Sniper Wolf would do the same, a deadly dance where both participants knew that a single mistake would be fatal. The PSG-1's sharp crack echoed across the snowfield each time they fired, the sound carrying despite the wind, announcing their positions, but also their skill. Miss by too much, and you gave away your location for nothing. Hit, and you forced your opponent to move, to expose themselves, to make the mistake that would let you take the killing shot. Snake could have used alternative weapons. The Nikita remote-controlled missiles would have allowed him to strike from safety, guiding the projectile around cover to hit Sniper Wolf without exposing himself. The Stinger launcher could have used its homing capability to track her heat signature through the snow. But something about this encounter demanded a purer approach. This was a duel between snipers, and it needed to be settled with sniper rifles, skill against skill, training against training, will against will. The battle lasted far longer than their first encounter. Both combatants were exhausted, pushed to their limits by the cold, the stress, the physical demands of maintaining precision while moving and shooting. Snake's hands shook despite the diazepam. His breathing was labored, his body was screaming for rest. But he pushed through, taking shot after shot, each one getting closer to ending this. Sniper Wolf was in worse shape. The wounds from their first encounter had not fully healed, and now Snake was adding to them with each successful hit. She was bleeding, weakening, her movements becoming slower and less precise. The diazepam in her system could only do so much. Eventually, pain and blood loss would overcome even her extraordinary conditioning and training. The final shot came when Sniper Wolf made a slight miscalculation, exposed herself for a fraction of a second too long while trying to acquire Snake in her scope. The PSG-1's round caught her in the lung, a catastrophic hit that no amount of willpower or training could overcome. She went down hard, and this time there was no deception, no trick, no guards waiting to ambush Snake. This time she was truly down. Snake approached carefully, his rifle still raised, but he could see that the fight had gone out of her. Sniper Wolf lay in the snow, blood spreading around her, coughing as her punctured lungs struggled to function. She was dying, and everyone present knew it. There would be no medical evacuation, no heroic last-minute save. This was the end that she had perhaps been seeking all along. As Snake stood over her, she began to speak, and what she said was not the defiant last words of a defeated enemy, not curses or threats or pleas for mercy. Instead, she told him her story. She spoke of her childhood, of being born on a battlefield, of being raised surrounded by gunfire, sirens, and screams. She described how those sounds had been her lullabies, the soundtrack to a childhood that no child should have to endure. She spoke of being hunted like a dog, of being driven from one ragged shelter to another, of never knowing security or peace. She described waking each morning to find more of her family and friends dead beside her, their bodies cold in the early light. Another reminder that survival was never guaranteed, that death was always just a heartbeat away. She spoke of staring at the morning sun and praying, not for happiness or comfort or any of the things children should want, but simply to make it through one more day. The governments of the world, she told Snake with undisguised bitterness, turned a blind eye to her people's misery. No one came to help. No one intervened. No one cared that thousands of Kurds were being systematically murdered. The international community watched and did nothing, allowing genocide to occur because it was politically convenient to ignore it. But then, she continued, he appeared. Her hero, Saladin, the man who had taken her away from all of that, who had seen value in a traumatized refugee child when everyone else saw only another casualty of war. Big Boss had given her a new life, new purpose, a reason to keep existing when everything she had known was gone. Snake understood immediately who she meant. The revelation that Sniper Wolf had been rescued and trained by Big Boss created a connection between them that went beyond mere combat. Big Boss was Snake's genetic father, the man he had been cloned from, the soldier whose shadow had defined so much of Snake's own life. That Sniper Wolf had known him, had been saved by him, had loved him with the devotion of someone whose entire existence had been redeemed by his intervention, made her death far more personal than Snake had anticipated. As Sniper Wolf's breathing became more labored, she looked up at Snake, and in her eyes, he saw not hatred or fear, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. She saw in him the same thing she had seen in Big Boss, the quality that made him a true soldier rather than simply a killer. And in that moment, she asked him a question that was really a plea. "Are you Saladin?" she whispered, confused by blood loss and approaching death, perhaps seeing in Solid Snake the ghost of the man who had saved her, perhaps unable in her final moments to distinguish between the genetic original and his clone. Snake did not answer directly. How could he explain the complicated truth about his relationship with Big Boss, about being a clone, about having fought and defeated the man who had been a father to her? Instead, he acknowledged her mercy toward Meryl, the fact that she had wounded rather than killed the young soldier during their first encounter. At that moment, Otacon appeared, emerging from wherever he had been hiding or observing. His face was streaked with tears, his voice broken with grief. He openly expressed his love for Sniper Wolf, telling her how he felt, giving voice to emotions that she had probably already understood but appreciated hearing nonetheless. He asked if there was anything he could do for her, any way he could help. Though they both knew there was nothing that could be done, Sniper Wolf made one final request. She asked Otacon to bring her the PSG-1, the rifle that had been such a constant companion throughout her life as a sniper. With shaking hands, Otacon retrieved the weapon and brought it to her. She held it close, finding comfort in its familiar weight and shape, the tool that had defined so much of who she had been forced to become. She looked at the three of them gathered around her, Otacon, who loved her, Snake, who had defeated her, and herself, bleeding out in the snow. "Everyone's here," she said softly, a statement that suggested something like contentment, or at least acceptance. In her final moments, she was not alone. That meant something. Then she spoke her last words, the phrase that would echo in the minds of players for years to come. "Okay, hero, set me free." It was a request, but also a command. An acknowledgement of what had to happen next, of what she needed from Snake, of the mercy that only he could provide. She was suffering, dying slowly, and she wanted it to end on her terms, at the hands of someone she respected, rather than simply bleeding out while the cold crept into her bones. She wanted a warrior's death, granted by another warrior, rather than the slow fade of hypothermia and blood loss. Snake understood. He removed the suppressor from his SOCOM pistol, perhaps as a gesture of respect, acknowledging that this was not a covert assassination, but an execution carried out in the open, nothing hidden, nothing disguised. He aimed, and in that moment, the weight of what he was about to do must have been crushing. This was not just eliminating an enemy. This was ending a life that had known so much suffering. Killing someone who had been shaped by circumstances beyond her control into something she had never wanted to be. He pulled the trigger. One shot, clean and final. Sniper Wolf's body went still, and the legendary marksman was gone. Her life ended in the same snow that had been the backdrop for their duel. The wolf had finally found the peace she had been seeking, the release from a lifetime of pain that had begun the day her family died in Iraqi Kurdistan and ended here on an island in Alaska, at the hands of a man who was perhaps the only person alive who could truly understand what she had been. Snake approached her body and draped her handkerchief over her face, a gesture of respect that covered her in death as she would have wanted. Otacon, through tears, asked why Snake had done this, and Snake's response revealed his own exhaustion with the soldier's life. "I'm returning it to its rightful owner. I have no more tears to shed." It was a statement that Otacon himself would later echo, years in the future, after watching another woman he cared for die. The handkerchief, this small piece of cloth that had passed from Sniper Wolf to Otacon to Snake and back to Sniper Wolf, became a symbol of the human connections that persist even in the midst of inhumanity. The capacity for gentleness that remains even in killers. The tears that soldiers pretend they do not shed. Sniper Wolf died on February 28, 2005, in the snowfield between the communication towers and the blast furnace on Shadow Moses Island. She was somewhere between 20 and 29 years old, the exact number lost to the chaos of her early life. She died as she had lived, a weapon in her hands, snow falling around her, alone except for the presence of 3 people who, in different ways, had seen beyond the soldier to glimpse the woman beneath. Her death was mourned even by her enemies. In the original Metal Gear Solid, after her defeat, the wolf dogs on Shadow Moses could be heard howling, grieving for the woman who had cared for them. In the remake, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, this detail was made explicit, with the wolves gathering around her body in the aftermath of the battle, refusing to leave the one person who had shown them kindness. The impact of Sniper Wolf's death on Otacon cannot be overstated. He had fallen in love with her, perhaps foolishly, perhaps inevitably given his circumstances and his nature. Her death was the first of several tragedies that would define his life, a pattern of losing women he cared for that would repeat with his stepsister Emma and later with Naomi Hunter. Each loss would reinforce the lesson that in the world of Metal Gear, the soldier's life leaves casualties that extend far beyond the battlefield, that everyone touched by war suffers, that gentleness and love are vulnerabilities that will inevitably be exploited or destroyed. For Snake, Sniper Wolf's death served as a stark reminder of the human cost of his missions. She had been an enemy, yes, but also a victim, someone who had been shaped by circumstances into a role she had never chosen. Killing her was necessary, but that necessity did not make it any less tragic. Her story, her pain, her brief moment of connection with Otacon, all of it would stay with Snake. Another weight added to the burden he carried as he continued through Shadow Moses toward his ultimate confrontation with Liquid and Metal Gear REX. And for players experiencing Metal Gear Solid, Sniper Wolf's death represented something rarely achieved in video games: genuine emotional impact from the loss of an antagonist. She was not just a boss to be defeated, but a character with depth, with history, with reasons for her actions that went beyond simple villainy. Her final moments, her dying words, the image of her lying in the snow with her rifle in her arms, all of it combined to create one of gaming's most powerful and memorable scenes. A moment that demonstrated the medium's potential for storytelling that could match any other art form. The death of Sniper Wolf on Shadow Moses Island in 2005 marked the end of her life, but not the end of her influence on the Metal Gear universe or on gaming culture more broadly. Her legacy would echo through subsequent games in the series, through the lives of those who knew her, and through the collective memory of players who encountered one of the medium's most tragic and well-crafted antagonists. For Hal Emmerich, Sniper Wolf's death was a wound that never fully healed. In the immediate aftermath of the Shadow Moses incident, Otacon was devastated by the loss. He had developed genuine feelings for her during his time as a hostage, and her death at Snake's hands forced him to confront the reality of the violent world he had inadvertently helped to create through his work on Metal Gear Rex. The weapon he had designed, believing it would be used for defense, had become an instrument of terror, and the woman he had cared for had died because of the conflict his creation helped facilitate. But Otacon did not allow grief to paralyze him. Instead, he channeled it into action, forming philanthropy with Solid Snake, an anti-Metal Gear organization dedicated to preventing the proliferation of nuclear-armed bipedal tanks. This decision represented Otacon's attempt to atone for his role in creating Rex, and to honor Sniper Wolf's memory by working to prevent the kind of conflicts that had shaped her tragic life. Every Metal Gear they exposed or destroyed was, in a sense, a strike against the system that had created child soldiers like Sniper Wolf, that had allowed genocides like the Al-Anfal campaign, that perpetuated cycles of violence that destroyed countless lives. In Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, set in 2009, Sniper Wolf was referenced during a conversation between Otacon and the game's protagonist Raiden. Otacon briefly mentioned her death in the context of discussing his stepsister Emma Emmerich, who had also died during the Big Shell incident. The parallel between these two losses, both women Otacon cared for dying as a result of the conflicts surrounding Metal Gear technology, reinforced the recurring theme of personal tragedy that defined his character. The Colonel AI, while infected with Emma's worm cluster virus, also made a brief reference to Sniper Wolf when discussing the PSG-1 rifle. Originally, Metal Gear Solid 2 was planned to include a more substantial reference to Sniper Wolf. The cyborg ninja, later revealed to be Olga Golokovich, was originally conceived as a machine that would use Sniper Wolf's voice to taunt Otacon and Meryl Silverberg's voice to taunt Snake. This would have been psychologically devastating for both characters, forcing them to confront their losses through the cruelty of technology mimicking the dead. However, this concept was not used in the final game, likely because it would have been too cruel even for Metal Gear Solid's deliberately tragic narrative. The most substantial homage to Sniper Wolf came in Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots, released in 2008. This game introduced the Beauty and the Beast unit, a group of 4 female soldiers whose codenames, weapons, and abilities referenced characters from previous Metal Gear Solid games. Each member of the unit had suffered severe psychological trauma that led to extreme post-traumatic stress disorder, and their power suits turned them into nearly unstoppable combat threats while also serving as symbols of their psychological damage. Crying Wolf, the unit's sniper, was the direct successor to Sniper Wolf's legacy. Her name obviously referenced Sniper Wolf, while her emotions echoed the sorrow from Metal Gear Solid 3, and her railgun was reminiscent of Fortune's weapon from Metal Gear Solid 2. But beyond these surface connections, Crying Wolf's story paralleled Sniper Wolf's in tragic ways. Like Sniper Wolf, Crying Wolf had witnessed genocide in Africa as a child. Like Sniper Wolf, she had been orphaned and traumatized by violence. Like Sniper Wolf, she had become a sniper whose skills were forged in the worst possible circumstances. The fight against Crying Wolf took place in the same snowfield on Shadow Moses Island, where Old Snake, the aged version of Solid Snake, had killed Sniper Wolf 9 years earlier. This was not coincidental. The game deliberately brought players back to that location, forcing them to confront the echoes of that earlier battle, to see how the cycle of violence had continued, to understand that Crying Wolf was essentially Sniper Wolf's spiritual successor, another victim of war's cruelty who had been turned into a weapon. After defeating Crying Wolf non-lethally, players could photograph her spirit using the in-game camera. Additionally, by taking a photograph of a specific door near the boiler room entrance following Crying Wolf's defeat, players could capture an image of Sniper Wolf's ghost, a spectral reminder of the woman who had died there years before. This subtle inclusion suggested that Sniper Wolf's spirit lingered at Shadow Moses, perhaps guarding the place of her death, perhaps unable to move on from the site of her final battle, or simply remembered by a land soaked in too much blood to forget any of the fallen. The presence of Crying Wolf and the ghost of Sniper Wolf in Metal Gear Solid 4 served multiple narrative purposes. It reinforced the game's themes about how violence perpetuates itself across generations, how the same tragedies repeat with different victims, how the world continues to create child soldiers and traumatized snipers despite knowing the human cost. It also provided a kind of closure for players who had been haunted by Sniper Wolf's death in the original game, acknowledging that her story had resonated and deserved to be remembered. In Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, set in 1984, Sniper Wolf did not appear because she had not yet been rescued by Big Boss during that time period. However, the game did include references to her through Quiet, another female sniper with a tragic backstory and exceptional skills. When players completed Mission 40, an extremely difficult variant of the Cloaked in Silence mission, Quiet would be wearing a costume that replicated Sniper Wolf's appearance, complete with the same hair color and style. Players who defeated this version of the mission unlocked the Sniper Wolf costume for Quiet, allowing them to have their companion sniper dress as the legendary marksman from the first Metal Gear Solid. This costume was more than just fan service. It created a visual link between these two tragic snipers, suggesting a thematic connection between women who had been shaped by war into weapons, who possessed extraordinary skills purchased at the cost of their humanity, who found themselves caught between loyalty and their own desires. Quiet's inability to speak due to her biological conditioning paralleled Sniper Wolf's emotional isolation, and both characters formed unexpected connections with the protagonists despite being on opposite sides of the conflict. The handkerchief item in The Phantom Pain also served as a reference to Sniper Wolf, though it was not explicitly her handkerchief. The item's description mentioned its ability to calm and soothe, echoing how Sniper Wolf's handkerchief in Metal Gear Solid carried her scent and could be used to pacify the wolf dogs. These small touches demonstrated how thoroughly Sniper Wolf had been woven into the fabric of the Metal Gear universe, how her presence lingered even in games set decades before her birth. Beyond the games themselves, Sniper Wolf's legacy persisted in Metal Gear's expanded universe. The Metal Gear Solid 4 database, a detailed encyclopedia of the series' lore, included extensive entries on Sniper Wolf, her background, and her role in the Shadow Moses incident. The official mission handbook for Metal Gear Solid elaborated on her experiences during and after the Alan Fall campaign before meeting Big Boss, providing additional context for her traumatic childhood. These supplementary materials helped flesh out her character beyond what the game itself could show, giving fans a more complete picture of who she was and what had shaped her. The enduring popularity of Sniper Wolf among Metal Gear fans led to significant merchandising. In 1998, McFarlane Toys released a 1/8 scale action figure of Sniper Wolf, one of the earliest high-quality video game character figures produced. The figure captured her distinctive appearance, complete with her PSG-1 rifle, and became a sought-after collectible. Two 1/6 scale figures were later released exclusively in Japan by Yamato and Studio Saru Bunshitsu, further demonstrating the character's appeal. In 2016, Kotobukiya released a Bishujo statue of Sniper Wolf designed by Shunya Yamashita and based on Yoji Shinkawa's original artwork. This statue represented a more stylized, contemporary take on the character while still remaining faithful to her core design. The attention to detail and the quality of the sculpting demonstrated that nearly 20 years after her debut, Sniper Wolf remained iconic enough to warrant premium collectibles. Konami itself recognized Sniper Wolf's enduring appeal. In 2012, the company held the E3 Battle event, a promotional tournament featuring 64 iconic Konami characters. Sniper Wolf was chosen as one of these representatives, the only female member of FOXHOUND to be included. She advanced through the early rounds, defeating Mimi and Naomi from Pop'n Music and Sybil Bennett from Silent Hill, before ultimately losing to Metal Gear REX in the semi-finals. The fact that she made it that far in a tournament that included characters from dozens of Konami franchises spoke to her significance within the company's history. Other game developers paid homage to Sniper Wolf as well. The game Army of Two included a barrel attachment called MGS Sniper Wolf MK. 2. A deliberate reference with altered spelling to avoid trademark issues. The Godfather 2 for PlayStation 3 included a weapon in its Level 4 Weapons Bundle DLC called MGS-1 Sniper Wolf, again with modified spelling but clear intent. The Division 2 featured a location called the Wolf's Den that contained a shadow of a wolf and a sniper rifle, another nod to the character. These references from unrelated games demonstrated how Sniper Wolf had transcended the Metal Gear series to become a recognized figure in gaming culture more broadly. Her influence even extended beyond gaming. Whisper the Wolf, a character created by writer Ian Flynn for the Sonic the Hedgehog comic series, was directly inspired by Sniper Wolf. While adapted to fit the Sonic universe, Whisper shared several characteristics with her inspiration. Exceptional sniping skills, a tragic backstory involving loss, an affinity for wolves, and a quiet, reserved personality. The fact that Sniper Wolf's character template was deemed strong enough to inspire characters in entirely different franchises and mediums speaks to the power of her original conception. The handkerchief that Sniper Wolf gave to Otacon became one of the most iconic items in Metal Gear Solid, despite being relatively simple in function. In the game, it served a practical purpose, allowing Snake to pacify the wolf dogs by masking his scent with hers. But symbolically, it represented so much more. The capacity for gentleness in a soldier, the human connections that persist through conflict, the small kindnesses that can occur even between enemies, and the tears that warriors claim they do not shed. That a simple piece of cloth could carry such narrative weight demonstrates the sophistication of Metal Gear Solid's storytelling. Interestingly, the Metal Gear Solid 4 database mistakenly referred to Sniper Wolf's handkerchief as a scarf, a minor continuity error that fans were quick to notice. While both items serve similar functions in terms of wearing or carrying them, the distinction mattered to those who remembered the specific detail of Otacon's gift to Snake in the original game. Such attention to detail from the fanbase demonstrates the investment players had in Sniper Wolf's story and the elements associated with it. The Metal Gear Solid official mission handbook and other guidebooks provided additional context for Sniper Wolf's skill set. Her ability to form emotional connections with targets before killing them, while unusual for a professional sniper, actually fit a pattern seen in some real-world cases where elite snipers report feeling a kind of intimate knowledge of their targets developed through extended observation. The emotional attachment served as a humanizing counterweight to the dehumanizing act of killing from a distance, a way of acknowledging the humanity she was taking even as she fulfilled her duties. Her addiction to diazepam also reflected real-world practices, though obviously taken to an extreme in the game. Beta blockers and anti-anxiety medications have been used by some competitive shooters and military personnel to reduce the physical symptoms of stress that can affect accuracy. The game's inclusion of this detail added a layer of realism to Sniper Wolf's character, while also highlighting the lengths to which she had to go to maintain her legendary accuracy, suggesting that even her extraordinary natural abilities required pharmaceutical enhancement to reach their full potential. The speculation by Liquid Snake that Sniper Wolf's heavy diazepam use might have protected her from FOXHOUND, the targeted bioweapon that killed several FOXHOUND members, added an interesting wrinkle to her story. FOXHOUND was programmed to kill specific individuals based on their genetic code, but Liquid theorized that the high concentration of benzodiazepines in Sniper Wolf's system might have somehow interfered with the pathogen's ability to target her. This was never confirmed or denied in the games, leaving it as an intriguing what-if scenario that suggested Sniper Wolf's drug addiction might have inadvertently saved her life, at least temporarily, until Snake's bullet ended it. The creation of Sniper Wolf represents a fascinating case study in how character design can evolve during the development process, and how a single suggestion can fundamentally alter the direction of an iconic character. The story of her creation involves Hideo Kojima, the visionary director behind the Metal Gear series, and Yoji Shinkawa, the talented artist whose distinctive visual style defined the look of Metal Gear Solid and subsequent games in the franchise. According to interviews with Shinkawa, the character who would become Sniper Wolf began as something quite different from what players eventually encountered. Kojima initially approached Shinkawa with a request to design a sniper character for FOXHOUND, and his original conception was for this character to be male. This would have fit the pattern of most of the other FOXHOUND members, who were predominantly men. A male sniper would have been unremarkable, expected, conventional. But Shinkawa had a different idea. Instead of simply executing Kojima's request as stated, he made a suggestion. "What do you think about a young lady with a sniper rifle?" This simple question changed everything. Kojima's response was enthusiastic and immediate. He loved the idea, recognizing that a female sniper would bring something unique to FOXHOUND's roster and would create opportunities for character development and emotional impact that a male character in the same role might not achieve. This anecdote reveals something important about the creative process behind Metal Gear Solid. Kojima encouraged his team to contribute their own ideas, to push back against initial concepts if they thought something better was possible, to collaborate in shaping the final product. Shinkawa's willingness to suggest a different approach, and Kojima's openness to that suggestion, resulted in one of the most memorable characters in gaming history. Shinkawa proceeded to design Sniper Wolf as a woman, creating multiple concept sketches that explored different visual approaches. The early designs featured green hair, a more unusual choice that would have made her visually striking. However, in the final game, her hair appeared as sandy blonde, possibly changed due to technical limitations of the PlayStation hardware, or because the team felt the blonde was more visually coherent with the game's overall aesthetic. Despite this change, Shinkawa's original vision clearly showed through in the final design. The concept art for Sniper Wolf included sketches showing her in various poses and outfits, demonstrating Shinkawa's process of exploring the character from multiple angles. Some of these sketches showed more revealing clothing, with one particular piece of concept art being fully topless. This reflected Shinkawa's approach of designing characters first as complete human forms before adding clothing, ensuring proper anatomical proportions and body language. The more revealing concepts were obviously not used in the final game, but they demonstrated the care taken in understanding the character's physicality before determining how to present her. Shinkawa's art style, characterized by bold brushwork and heavy use of shadow and light, was perfect for the tone Kojima wanted to achieve with Metal Gear Solid. The game was meant to be more grounded and gritty than previous entries in the series, with character designs that felt realistic rather than overtly stylized. Sniper Wolf's design achieved this balance, looking like someone who could actually exist as a Special Forces operator while still possessing the visual distinctiveness that made her instantly recognizable. The decision to make her blonde may have been influenced by practical considerations as well as aesthetic ones. Blonde hair shows up well in snow environments, creating visual contrast that makes the character easier to spot during gameplay, while also being thematically appropriate for a sniper who operates in winter conditions. The long hair, while potentially impractical for actual military operations, added to her feminine appearance and created interesting visual dynamics during cutscenes, particularly in death scenes where her hair would flow across the snow. Her outfit was designed to be practical, yet distinctive. The bodysuit she wore was tight-fitting, emphasizing her feminine form while also being functional for someone who needed freedom of movement and minimal bulk. The outfit included practical elements like gloves and boots suitable for cold weather operations, grounding the design in at least some degree of realism. The exposed skin on her upper chest area, while perhaps not entirely practical for Arctic operations, served multiple purposes. It made her visually distinctive. It emphasized her femininity in ways that played into both her character and the game's themes about female soldiers in combat roles, and it created a memorable silhouette that players could recognize even from a distance. Kojima provided additional context for Sniper Wolf's creation in various interviews. He mentioned that part of the inspiration for the character came from the female Viet Cong sniper scene in Stanley Kubrick's film Full Metal Jacket. That scene, which depicts an American squad being picked off one by one by an unseen female sniper before finally confronting her in her broken, dying state, clearly influenced both the structure of Sniper Wolf's boss battles and the emotional impact of her death scene. The power of Full Metal Jacket's sniper sequence came from the contrast between the sniper's effectiveness as a killer and her vulnerability as a dying person, a dynamic that Metal Gear Solid replicated and expanded upon. Another cinematic influence on Sniper Wolf's character can be found in one of her dialogue lines, though it did not appear in all versions of the game. In the original Metal Gear Solid, she tells Snake, "Well, I'm going to send you a love letter, my dear. Do you know what that is? It's a bullet straight from my gun to your heart." This line was lifted directly from David Lynch's film Blue Velvet, another example of Kojima's habit of weaving cinematic references throughout his games. The line adds a darkly romantic tone to the sniper duel, framing the act of killing as an intimate exchange between two warriors. The Turkish pun on Sniper Wolf's name adds another layer to her characterization. In Turkish, the word for Kurd is Kurt, while the word for wolf is Kurt, creating a phonetic similarity that has been used both positively and negatively throughout history. When Snake surmises that Wolf's codename might be derived from her Kurdish heritage, he employs this wordplay favorably, noting that wolves are noble animals. This detail demonstrates the care Kojima and his team took in creating culturally appropriate background for their characters, connecting Sniper Wolf's identity as a Kurd to her codename as a wolf in a way that honors both elements. Voice acting played a crucial role in bringing Sniper Wolf to life. In the Japanese version of Metal Gear Solid, she was voiced by Naoko Nakamura, who brought a cold, precise quality to the character, while also conveying the emotional pain beneath her professional exterior. In the English version, Tassia Valenza provided Sniper Wolf's voice, and her performance became iconic in its own right. Valenza's delivery of Sniper Wolf's lines walked a fine line between threatening and tragic. Her voice conveyed the character's skill and confidence during the sniper duels, making players believe in her danger as an opponent. But in the death scene, Valenza's performance shifted to reveal the profound pain and weariness that Sniper Wolf had been carrying throughout her life. The famous dying words, "I was born on a battlefield, raised on a battlefield," are delivered with a mixture of bitterness, exhaustion, and acceptance that makes the scene emotionally devastating. David Hayter, the voice actor for Solid Snake, spoke about Sniper Wolf in interviews, calling her his favorite Metal Gear character. "Wolf. Very hot, very dangerous," he said, succinctly capturing what made the character so compelling. Coming from the actor who brought Snake to life, this praise carried weight, suggesting that even those deeply involved in creating Metal Gear Solid recognized something special about Sniper Wolf's characterization. Yoji Shinkawa himself mentioned in subsequent interviews that Sniper Wolf remained popular among the staff at Konami years after Metal Gear Solid's release. This persistent appreciation from the development team speaks to how successful the character's design and implementation had been. Characters that resonate with their creators tend to be the ones that resonate with audiences as well. And the Konami staff's continued fondness for Sniper Wolf suggested they understood they had created something special. The design process for characters in Metal Gear Solid was notably different from typical game character design of the era. Kojima and Shinkawa were not trying to create exaggerated, over-the-top video game characters with ridiculous proportions and impractical weapons, though some members of FOXHOUND did possess those qualities. Instead, they aimed for a more grounded, cinematic approach, designing characters who could believably exist in the world they were creating, while still being visually interesting enough to work in a video game context. Sniper Wolf exemplified this design philosophy. Her appearance was striking, but not impossible. Her weapon was real and recognizable to firearms enthusiasts. Her outfit, while stylized, incorporated practical elements. Her backstory, while tragic, was grounded in actual historical events. She felt like a real person who had been shaped by real circumstances, rather than a collection of video game tropes assembled to create a boss battle. The remake of Metal Gear Solid, released in 2004 as Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes for the GameCube, updated Sniper Wolf's visual appearance with improved graphics, but maintained Shinkawa's original design philosophy. The higher polygon count and better textures allowed for more detail, but the fundamental character design remained unchanged, a testament to the strength of the original concept. Some fans felt that the remake's inclusion of first-person aiming made the Sniper Wolf battle too easy, removing some of the tension and difficulty that had made the original encounter so memorable. though this criticism spoke more to gameplay changes than to the character design itself. In 2012, Kojima reflected on the development of Metal Gear Solid, mentioning that he had found it difficult to explain the concept of the Sniper Wolf battle to his staff. This suggests that the vision for how the sniper duels would work, both mechanically and emotionally, was clear in Kojima's mind, but challenging to communicate. The fact that the final product succeeded so well speaks to the team's ability to understand and execute Kojima's vision despite the communication challenges. The legacy of Sniper Wolf's design can be seen in subsequent Metal Gear games and in the broader gaming industry. Female snipers became more common in games after Metal Gear Solid, and many of them bore at least some resemblance to Sniper Wolf in terms of characterization, aesthetics, or both. The archetype of the tragic female sniper with exceptional skills and a heartbreaking backstory became something of a trope, and while not all iterations were as successful as the original, the fact that Sniper Wolf inspired so many similar characters speaks to the impact of Shinkawa's design and Kojima's characterization. The impact of Sniper Wolf extended far beyond the Metal Gear series itself, making her one of the most recognized and beloved characters in gaming history. Her cultural resonance can be measured through critical reception, fan appreciation, industry recognition, and the lasting influence she has had on how video games portray female characters, particularly female antagonists. Critical reception of Sniper Wolf was overwhelmingly positive from the moment Metal Gear Solid released in 1998. Game reviewers recognized that she represented something different in video game storytelling, an antagonist with sufficient depth and humanity to elicit genuine emotional responses from players. Her boss battles were praised not just for their mechanical challenge, but for their psychological weight. The way they forced players to confront an enemy who was more than just an obstacle to be overcome. In 2006, Ryan Stewart and Rich Kirpata of the Boston Phoenix ranked the fight against Sniper Wolf as the 16th greatest boss battle in video game history. They described her as the best aspect of FOXHOUND and her death as one of gaming's most poignant scenes. This assessment, coming from critics reviewing the entire history of gaming up to that point, demonstrated that Sniper Wolf had transcended her original context to become part of the broader conversation about what video games could achieve as an artistic medium. The year 2008 saw particularly strong recognition for Sniper Wolf. IGN, one of the gaming industry's most prominent media outlets, held a reader poll for the best Metal Gear series villains. Sniper Wolf won the top position by a landslide. The IGN staff commented, "Who else could number one be but the incredibly beautiful and impossibly deadly Sniper Wolf?" They added that, "It's safe to say, Wolf earned more votes than just about every other villain combined, a fact that doesn't surprise us at all." This overwhelming victory in a fan vote demonstrated just how deeply the character had resonated with Metal Gear players. That same year, IGN's PlayStation team ranked the fight against Sniper Wolf as the 6th best boss battle in the series. Their commentary noted that, in the history of video games, few bosses have brought us to our knees the way Sniper Wolf did. When Snake and Wolf finally tussled on the frozen, tree-filled lot on Shadow Moses, fans were treated to a sniper v. sniper battle that made you fear and respect your adversary. Sniper Wolf's motives were admirable, her character was brilliant, and her relationship with Otacon added yet another layer to the game's lauded story. GameSpy also ranked Sniper Wolf highly in their list of boss battles, placing her 7th on their compilation. The consistency of these high rankings across multiple publications and voting mechanisms demonstrated that critical appreciation of Sniper Wolf was not limited to a single outlet or perspective, but represented a genuine consensus about her quality as a character and as a gameplay challenge. In 2010, IGN compiled a list of the top 100 video game villains of all time, and Sniper Wolf was ranked 92nd. The staff noted that she probably deserves to be higher on our list, and emphasized the feeling of helplessness caused by fighting an enemy who was watching you from an unknown position. The mere fact that she appeared on such a list at all, competing against villains from decades of gaming history across all genres and platforms, spoke to her lasting impact. PlayStation Universe ranked Sniper Wolf as the 10th sexiest PlayStation character in 2010. adding that this character takes a special place in our hearts. While rankings based on sex appeal can be reductive, this particular assessment also acknowledged her emotional impact beyond mere physical appearance, suggesting that her attractiveness was inseparable from her compelling characterization and tragic story. Fan engagement with Sniper Wolf extended well beyond professional critics' assessments. Online communities dedicated to Metal Gear Solid frequently cited her as a favorite character, with extensive discussions analyzing her backstory, motivations, and significance to the series' themes. Fan art depicting Sniper Wolf was abundant and varied, ranging from faithful recreations of Shinkawa's original designs to reinterpretations that placed her in different contexts or artistic styles. The volume and quality of fan-created content demonstrated active engagement with the character that persisted long after Metal Gear Solid's initial release. Cosplayers embraced Sniper Wolf as well, with her distinctive outfit and PSG-1 rifle making her a recognizable figure at gaming conventions worldwide. The challenges of creating an accurate Sniper Wolf costume, particularly replicating the PSG-1 in prop form, meant that high-quality cosplays represented significant investments of time and skill, further demonstrating fans' dedication to the character. The character's cultural impact extended into academic discussions about video game narratives and representations of women in gaming. Sniper Wolf became a case study in how female characters could be portrayed as competent, dangerous, and complex without relying solely on the sexualization that characterized many female video game characters of the era. While her design certainly included attractive elements, and the game did not shy away from acknowledging her beauty, her character was not defined by it. Her skills, her tragic backstory, and her emotional depth were what made her memorable, with her appearance serving as one element among many rather than her sole defining characteristic. Discussions about female representation in gaming often pointed to Sniper Wolf as an example of how to create a female antagonist who could be taken seriously as both a threat and as a person. She was not simply the girl boss or the sexy sniper, but a fully realized character whose gender was part of her identity without being her only trait. This nuanced portrayal was rare in 1998 and remains impressive even by contemporary standards. The relationship between Sniper Wolf and Otacon also received attention in critical analyses of Metal Gear Solid's narrative. Their connection, characterized by her small kindnesses toward him, despite being his captor, and his genuine affection for her, despite understanding she was part of a terrorist operation, represented a humanizing element in a story that could easily have painted FOXHOUND as purely villainous. The fact that Otacon could love Sniper Wolf while being opposed to the actions of her unit demonstrated the game's commitment to portraying moral complexity rather than simple good versus evil dynamics. Some critics analyzed the Stockholm Syndrome aspect of Otacon's feelings for Sniper Wolf, discussing whether his attachment represented genuine emotion or psychological manipulation resulting from his captivity. The game itself leaves this ambiguous, suggesting that perhaps both elements were present, that Otacon's feelings were real even if the circumstances that created them were abnormal. This ambiguity added to the tragedy of Sniper Wolf's death, as Otacon's grief was authentic regardless of how his feelings originated. The emotional impact of Sniper Wolf's death scene has been widely discussed and analyzed. Stephen Poole, in his book Trigger Happy, noted how Metal Gear Solid was brilliantly manipulative in making players feel genuine guilt for killing Sniper Wolf, despite the fact that it makes no sense to wish that you hadn't killed Sniper Wolf, that is, properly to regret your actions, because it is a task that the game demands be fulfilled before you can progress. This observation highlighted one of the unique aspects of video game storytelling. The player must participate in creating the tragedy they then feel guilty about, an interactive element that books, films, or other non-interactive media cannot replicate. In 2012, Ryan King of Play magazine included Sniper Wolf among 6 things you didn't want to kill, but you did anyway, while Ian Dransfield from the same publication included her among top bad guys you wanted to win. These seemingly contradictory sentiments actually reinforce each other, demonstrating that Sniper Wolf successfully elicited sympathy, despite being an antagonist, making players wish she could have won or survived, even though they understood the narrative required her death. Alexander Gilyadov from VentureBeat in 2015 included Sniper Wolf's death among 6 most memorable Metal Gear moments, stating that it still remains as one of the most poignant and beautiful scenes in the entire series. It also displays just how multi-layered, benign and emotional the characters are in Metal Gear. This assessment, coming 17 years after the game's original release, demonstrated that the scene's emotional power had not diminished with time or with changes in gaming graphics and storytelling sophistication. The scene's ability to create genuine emotional impact through relatively limited graphical capabilities, with PlayStation-era polygon models and no voice acting during the actual death moment, speaks to the strength of the writing, direction, and voice acting that preceded it. Players filled in emotional details through the power of suggestion and their investment in the characters, proving that technical limitations need not prevent powerful storytelling. Comparisons between Sniper Wolf and other gaming characters, both those that preceded her and those that came after, often worked in her favor. She was frequently cited as superior to earlier female video game characters who lacked her depth, and she set a standard that many subsequent characters struggled to match. When evaluating new female snipers or female antagonists in games, reviewers and fans often asked whether they achieved what Sniper Wolf achieved, whether they felt as fully realized, whether their deaths would carry similar emotional weight. The sex appeal aspect of Sniper Wolf's character received mixed critical reception. Game Daily ranked her 37th in their list of hottest babes in games in 2008, and Yugo included her in their list of the 50 hottest babes in games in 2011. Cheat Code Central's Travis Huber in 2014 included her among the top 10 hottest female villains in gaming and old-school hotties that still got it, noting that she was so loved and talked about that Hideo Kojima and the gang have had to create yet another beautiful but deadly sniper character in the upcoming MGS5, the Phantom Pain. While some critics argue that such rankings reduce complex characters to their physical appearance, others note that Sniper Wolf's inclusion in lists that ranked both attractiveness and character quality demonstrated that she succeeded on multiple levels. Her design was aesthetically appealing, but players remembered her for far more than just her appearance. The beauty enhanced the tragedy rather than defining it, adding another dimension to an already layered character. The lasting influence of Sniper Wolf on the Metal Gear series itself cannot be overstated. She established a template that the series would return to repeatedly. The tragic female combatant with exceptional skills and a heartbreaking backstory. Characters like the boss in Metal Gear Solid 3, Crying Wolf in Metal Gear Solid 4, and Quiet in Metal Gear Solid 5 all bore some resemblance to this template, though each brought their own unique elements. The fact that the series kept returning to variations on this characterization suggests both that it worked and that Kojima and his team recognized Sniper Wolf's success and wanted to explore similar emotional territory with different characters. Sniper Wolf's legacy extends beyond gaming into broader popular culture. References to her appear in various media. Her name is invoked in discussions about video game characters who transcended their medium. And her death scene is frequently included in compilations of gaming's most emotional moments. She has become, in essence, a cultural touchstone, a character that even people who have never played Metal Gear Solid might recognize by name or by association, similar to how even non-gamers might know about characters like Mario or Sonic. The merchandising success of Sniper Wolf, from the original McFarlane Toys figure to the 2016 Kotobukiya statue and beyond, demonstrated sustained commercial interest in the character nearly 2 decades after her debut. Companies don't invest in creating high-end collectibles for characters that lack enduring appeal. And the fact that new Sniper Wolf merchandise continued to be produced and sold successfully so many years later proved that her fan base remained active and willing to purchase quality products featuring her likeness. The E3 Battle Tournament, where Sniper Wolf advanced through multiple rounds before losing to Metal Gear Rex, showcased both Konami's recognition of her importance to their history and fans' continued investment in the character. That she was one of only 64 Konami characters chosen to represent the company's entire library of games, spanning decades and numerous franchises, demonstrated her iconic status within Konami's portfolio. The story of Sniper Wolf is, At its core, a story about the cost of violence and the inescapability of trauma. It begins in the dust and blood of Iraqi Kurdistan during one of the 20th century's most brutal genocides, follows a child who survived when she should have died, traces her transformation into a weapon through brainwashing and training, documents her rescue and repurposing by a legendary soldier, and concludes in an Alaskan snowfield where that weapon finally breaks down, unable to continue, seeking only the mercy of an ending. She was born into violence that she did not create and could not control. The Al-Anfal campaign that killed her family and thousands of other Kurds was not a consequence of anything she did, but the result of geopolitical forces, ethnic hatred, and a brutal regime's decision that Kurdish lives were expendable. She did nothing to deserve the trauma she experienced as a child, yet that trauma defined the rest of her life, shaping her into someone whose skills at killing were matched only by her weariness with killing. Big Boss gave her a second life, removing the Iraqi brainwashing while preserving the fighting skills that made her valuable. But was this rescue or simply recruitment? Did he save her for her own sake, or because he recognized a talent that could be useful to him? The ambiguity of this question is part of what makes Sniper Wolf's story so tragic. Even her salvation was complicated, tainted by the military needs of the man who saved her, never quite free from the instrumentalization that had defined her existence since the Iraqi Ministry of Interior first decided to turn a traumatized child into a sniper. Her loyalty to Big Boss was absolute, but it was a loyalty born from desperation rather than choice. When you have been abandoned by the entire world, when everyone who should have protected you has failed or died, when the only person who showed you kindness in the midst of horror was a soldier who trained you to be a better killer, where else can your loyalty go? She called him Saladin not just as a term of respect, but as an act of cultural reclamation. Taking a Kurdish hero and applying his name to the man who had been her hero, creating a bridge between her ethnic identity and her role as an American Special Forces operator. Shadow Moses represented Sniper Wolf's attempt to strike back at the system that had created her. The governments that ignored Kurdish suffering, that allowed genocide to occur, that treated her people as expendable, would finally face consequences. It was a doomed rebellion, fueled more by rage and grief than by any realistic hope of success. But it gave her purpose in the years after Big Boss's apparent death, a way to honor his memory while punishing those who had failed the Kurds. Her death was inevitable from the moment she joined the uprising. Soldiers like Sniper Wolf do not retire peacefully. They die in the field, and if they are lucky, they die quickly at the hands of someone who respects what they were. Snake gave her that death. He did not make her suffer more than necessary. He granted her final request to be set free, ending a life that had known too little freedom and too much pain. The tragedy of Sniper Wolf is that all her exceptional skills, all her training, all her experiences amounted to becoming the perfect tool for others to use. First, the Iraqi regime used her against her own people. Then Big Boss used her for whatever his purposes were in saving and training her. Then FOXHOUND used her in their rebellion. Even in her final moments, dying in the snow, she was still serving someone else's agenda. Still playing a role in a larger conflict, still unable to be simply herself rather than a weapon pointed by someone else. Yet within that tragedy is something like redemption. Her kindness to the wolf dogs, her mercy toward Merrill, her gift of the handkerchief to Otacon. These small acts of humanity demonstrated that beneath the conditioning and trauma, something human persisted. She could still choose, even if only in small ways, to be gentle when gentleness served no tactical purpose. To show mercy when mercy was a weakness, to connect with others even though connections made her vulnerable. Otacon's love for her, genuine despite being influenced by Stockholm Syndrome, represented recognition of that humanity. He saw past the sniper to the woman, understood that she was a victim before she was a perpetrator, mourned her death as the loss of a person rather than simply the elimination of an enemy. His grief honored who she could have been if the world had been kinder, if the Kurds had been protected, if a child born on a rainy day in Iraqi Kurdistan had been allowed to simply be a child rather than being forged into a weapon. The impact Sniper Wolf has had on gaming culture, the fact that players remember her decades after Metal Gear Solid's release, speaks to something fundamental about storytelling in interactive media. Video games allow players to participate in creating narrative outcomes, and when those outcomes involve tragedy, the emotional impact can be more profound than passive observation of similar events in films or books. Every player who killed Sniper Wolf participated in creating that tragic moment, pulled the trigger themselves, experienced the victory of defeating a difficult boss, immediately complicated by the recognition that this victory required ending a life that had already known too much suffering. She stands as a testament to what video games can achieve when they treat their characters as more than obstacles or rewards. When they invest in creating people whose stories matter, whose deaths carry weight, whose humanity persists even in the midst of inhuman circumstances. She proved that antagonists could be sympathetic without being weak, that female characters could be beautiful without being reduced to their beauty, that video games could make players feel genuine emotions beyond excitement and frustration. When we remember Sniper Wolf, we remember not just a boss battle or a striking character design, but a story about survival, about trauma, about the ways violence perpetuates itself across generations and borders, about how people shaped into weapons can still retain fragments of humanity, about the cost of war measured not in territory or resources, but in individual lives damaged beyond repair. We remember a woman who was born on a battlefield, raised on a battlefield, and died on a battlefield, but who in between those moments of violence found small ways to demonstrate that she was more than what the world had made her. Her handkerchief, that simple piece of cloth that carried her scent and allowed Snake to calm the wolves, serves as a fitting symbol for her legacy. Like the handkerchief, she left her mark on the Metal Gear series and on gaming history. A trace of who she was that persists long after her death, that serves a purpose beyond what she intended, that reminds us of her humanity even when everything else about the story is about war and violence and death. The wolves still howl on Shadow Moses Island, mourning the woman who cared for them. Players still make the trek through that snowfield, still fight that duel, still experience the impact of her dying words. Critics still analyze her character and the power of her death scene. And somewhere in that confluence of gameplay, storytelling, and emotional resonance, Sniper Wolf transcended being simply a video game character to become something more enduring, a figure who embodies both the costs of violence and the persistence of humanity in the face of forces designed to erase it. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the complete story of Sniper Wolf from Metal Gear Solid. Her tale is one that stays with players long after they've finished the game, a reminder of the power of storytelling in interactive media and a testament to what makes the Metal Gear series so special. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of gaming's most tragic and memorable characters, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Lore Save Point for more in-depth analyses of RPG and video game lore. There are countless stories waiting to be told, characters whose depths deserve exploration, and narratives that reveal new layers with each examination. Until next time, remember that even in stories about soldiers and war, humanity persists in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the most powerful moments come not from victory, but from understanding. Thanks for watching.